So, you want to own a Roman gladiator school, a ludus, sand raked smooth in the practice yard, wooden swords cracking against shields at dawn, the crowd roaring your name 2 streets over at the amphitheater while your fighters bleed for it. Here's a real number. When the Emperor Trajan celebrated his conquest of Dacia in 107 AD, the games he threw ran for 123 days and put roughly 10,000 gladiators into the arena. Somebody owned every single one of those men. Somebody fed them, trained them, insured them against nothing, and negotiated their price before they ever stepped onto sand that could kill them. Very few people think about the ledger behind the spectacle. Fewer still ask what a dead gladiator actually cost his owner, or why the safest job in the arena wasn't fighting at all. This is what running a ludus actually looked like from the inside. Not the poet's version, the contract's version. So, let's open one from scratch and follow the money all the way to the sand. Start with the man who priced it. His name was Marcus Aurelius, not the emperor, a different one. A proconsul who in 177 AD grew so alarmed at what gladiators cost that he asked the Senate to fix prices by law. The resulting document survives, carved into bronze in Italica in modern Spain. It's called the Senatus Consultum de Sumptibus Ludorum Gladiatorum, and it is, without exaggeration, the closest thing history has handed us to an actual price list for human beings sold into the arena. Read it carefully and the whole business opens up. First, be precise about what you're buying. Not the Colosseum, that's the venue, not your property. You're buying and running the ludus, the training school that supplies fighters to whoever's hosting the games. The editor. The biggest ludus in the empire, the Ludus Magnus, sat right behind the Colosseum itself, connected by an underground tunnel, and archaeologists have excavated its own miniature training arena inside the walls. That's the model. Yours will be smaller. A barracks, a practice yard, cells, an infirmary, and a small fortune in men. Now the money. Roman prices run through sesterces, and the one number worth memorizing is this. An ordinary laborer in the 1st or 2nd century earned somewhere around 3 to 4 sesterces a day. That's our ruler. Everything gets measured in working days, not coins, because coins lie and labor doesn't. The bronze tablet from Italica breaks gladiators into 5 price grades, 1st grade down to 5th, and sets a ceiling on what an editor can be charged per fighter depending on the tier of games he's throwing. At the top end, a 1st grade gladiator supplied for a major show could be billed out at up to 15,000 sesterces. That's nearly 4,000 working days for one man's single appearance in the arena. Even a cheap fighter, bottom grade, still ran into the hundreds of sesterces per bout. The Senate wasn't setting these prices low because gladiators were cheap. It was setting them low because, before the law, lanista, that's you, the school owner, had been charging so much that towns were going broke trying to host games at all. So here's your first real decision, and it's the one that decides everything else. Where do your fighters come from? There are 3 sources, and they cost wildly different amounts. Condemned criminals, damnati, cost you almost nothing beyond feeding them, because the state hands them over, and their life expectancy in the arena is brutally short. Prisoners of war arrive in bulk after a campaign, cheap in the same way, expendable in the same way. And then there are the men who actually make a ludus profitable, purchased slaves trained from scratch, and free men called octorati, volunteers who sign a contract, take an oath, the sacramentum gladiatorium, binding themselves to be whipped, burned, and killed if their owner commands it, in exchange for a signing bonus and a cut of future winnings. The historian Petronius has a freedman in his Satyricon casually mention gladiator troops and how much a good one is worth. And by the late Republic, satirists were mocking bankrupt Roman aristocrats who'd sunk fortunes into famous, expensive fighters. A trained, experienced gladiator, someone who'd already survived several bouts and built a following, could represent an investment of 1,000 to 2,000 sesterces just to acquire, before a single day of training or feeding. That's 300 to 600 working days sunk into one man who might die in his next fight. Multiply that by a school of 20, 30, 50 fighters, and you understand why the ancient sources describe lanistae less as sportsmen and more as men everyone in polite Roman society quietly despised while secretly needing. And that's the detail that decides how this story ends for you. Roman law formally classified lanistae among the infamies, the disreputable, the same legal category as pimps and actors, barred from certain honors, looked down on by the aristocracy who nonetheless couldn't stop watching what you produced. You you are not buying respect. You're buying a very specific kind of profitable contempt. Now, the staff, because a gladiator school doesn't run on fighters alone, you need a doctore, a trainer, usually a retired gladiator himself, who drills the men on specific fighting styles. The heavily armored secutor, the net and trident retiarius, the mounted equites. Real doctores specializing in each weapon type appear across surviving inscriptions, each one a paid professional, not cheap labor. You need a medicus, a physician, because a wounded gladiator who dies of infection after surviving his bout is money rotting in a cell. The most famous name in this line of work is Galen, who spent years as physician to the gladiators of Pergamon before becoming the most influential doctor in the ancient world. And he wrote later that treating gladiators taught him more about human anatomy than almost anything else, because he was, in his own words, watching wounds that other doctors never got to see, on men who had to be patched up and fighting again within weeks. You need guards, because a barracks full of armed, angry, often enslaved men is a standing security risk, and Roman history remembers exactly how badly that can go. In 73 BC, a gladiator named Spartacus broke out of a ludus in Capua with around 70 others, armed themselves with kitchen tools and captured weapons, and within 2 years had an army large enough to defeat multiple Roman legions. Every lanista after that date trained his men inside walls built with that story in mind. Feeding this operation is its own quiet drain. Gladiators ate a diet heavy in barley and legumes, so consistently that Roman writers nicknamed them hordearii, barley men. And modern isotopic analysis of gladiator skeletons from Ephesus confirmed a diet extremely high in plant carbohydrates, likely deliberately, to build a layer of subcutaneous fat that let fighters bleed dramatically for the crowd without dying immediately from a shallow cut. Feeding 50 men on that scale, every single day, whether they fight that month or not, is a fixed cost with the same discipline as the furnace under a bathhouse. It never turns off. Add the equipment, armor, shields, the specific weapon sets for each fighting style, all custom fitted, all needing repair after every bout, all representing capital sitting in a storeroom depreciating whether it's used or not. So by now you've spent a fortune on men, staff, food, and steel, and you haven't been paid a single sesterce. Time to see how a ludus actually earns. The first and most obvious income is the fee an editor pays you to supply fighters for his games. That's the number the Italica tablet was regulating. But here's what the surface number hides. You weren't paid the same for every fighter, and you weren't paid the same for every outcome. A veteran crowd favorite, someone with wins recorded on his own gravestone, like the gladiator Flamma, whose tombstone in Sicily proudly lists 4 wreaths and 34 fights survived before his death at 30, commanded a premium every single time he stepped into the sand, because editors were buying spectacle, and spectacle had a face and a following. The second stream is survival itself, and this is the detail every popular telling gets wrong. Most gladiatorial bouts did not end in death. Surviving fight records and tombstones suggest the large majority of contests ended with one fighter yielding, missio, and being spared, particularly by the height of the imperial period, when a dead gladiator was, from a purely commercial standpoint, a destroyed asset. Historians estimate death rates per individual bout somewhere in the range of 1 in 5 to 1 in 10, varying by period and venue. That number matters enormously to you as an owner, because a gladiator who survives 10 fights and builds a fan base is worth more with every bout, the way a boxer's purse grows with his record. A dead gladiator, 3 months into training, is a total loss of every sesterce you spent acquiring and feeding him. This is why the best lanistae fought hard, sometimes literally bribing editors and referees to keep their star fighters alive. Your incentives and the crowd's bloodlust were never actually aligned. The crowd wanted a show. You wanted your investment walking back to its cell. The third stream is the one nobody puts in the movie. Renting out your trained men for private security, for parades, for bodyguard work between games, and, more darkly, contracting them out to wealthy Romans who wanted armed muscle for a private dispute. Cicero mentions gladiators being used this way in the chaotic street politics of the late Republic, hired muscle with a professional pedigree. A ludus, sitting idle between official games, was a ludus wasting an asset, so smart owners kept their men earning in the gaps. And there's a fourth stream, subtler than the rest, the octorati, the free volunteers. When a free citizen signed himself into your ludus, he typically received a lump sum signing bonus up front, and in exchange, he owed you his fighting career and a share of his future prize money. You were, in effect, running a talent agency with a whip in the contract. Petronius's characters gossip about famous gladiators the way modern crowds gossip about athletes, and that fame, once built, was an asset you controlled and could keep renting out fight after fight. Add the streams together: supply fees, survival value compounding fighter by fighter, private hire, and contracted talent, and the ludus stops looking like a butcher's yard and starts looking exactly like what the Romans themselves half admitted it was: a training academy that happened to sell its graduates violence by the afternoon. Now here's what breaks it. The first threat is the one carved right into that Italica tablet: political interference in your pricing. The Senate fixed your fees specifically because lanista had been extracting towns dry, which means your upside was legally capped from 177 AD onward, while your costs, feeding 50 barley men and paying a physician, were not. The second threat lives in the yard itself. You are housing armed men who have every reason to hate you, and history's most famous slave revolt started in exactly one ludus, in exactly this business. Every wall you build after Spartacus is a wall built out of fear, and fear is expensive. Guards, restraints, informants among your own fighters, all cost money that produces no revenue, only the absence of catastrophe. The third threat is disease and injury outside the arena entirely. 50 men packed into shared barracks, training daily with edged weapons, are one infection away from losing half your inventory to something that never happened under the lights. Galen's own writings describe treating infected wounds that killed gladiators weeks after a bout they'd technically survived. The kind of loss that shows up nowhere in the arena record and everywhere in your accounts. The fourth threat ended the entire industry, and it wasn't a riot or a plague. It was Christianity's rise to state religion. The Emperor Honorius formally abolished gladiatorial games in 404 AD, and while enforcement was gradual and combat spectacles lingered in fading forms for decades after, the economic and moral foundation of the business, an empire willing to publicly fund human combat as civic entertainment, simply stopped existing. Roughly 5 centuries after the first documented gladiatorial games in Rome, the entire profession, every ludus, every doctore, every barley diet, ended by imperial decree. So, knowing all of it, the bronze price tablet, the barley men, Galen stitching wounds, Spartacus's wall, was this ever a good business? Run the good year first. You own a mid-sized ludus with 2 or 3 genuine crowd favorites, men like Flamma, fighters whose names alone raise your supply fee. Your death rate stays low because you've bribed the right officials, and your doctore knows exactly which matchups favor survival over spectacle. Your fighters age into veteran status, each surviving bout adding to their value rather than subtracting from your roster. You rent idle men for private security between games. The octorati keep signing up because your school has a reputation for winners walking out alive. A good ludus, run well, was a legitimate and lucrative business. However despised its owner remained at every Roman dinner party that quietly invited him anyway. Now the bad year. A political rival convinces the local magistrate to cap your fees harder than the law requires. A fever moves through the barracks and takes 3 of your best men in a single month, representing years of training gone with nothing to show. A promising young fighter dies in his second bout, a total loss before he ever earned back what you paid for him. And underneath everything sits the same quiet threat Spartacus proved was never theoretical. The men making you rich are men you're keeping by force, in a building you built specifically because you knew, deep down, that the arrangement could end with them killing you first. That's the honest ledger behind the sand and the roar of the crowd. Not a story about violence for its own sake, but a story about a man who bought human capital at brutal prices, insured it against nothing, and tried, every single day, to keep his most valuable assets alive long enough to make him rich. In a business the empire respected his money for and despised his name for, right up until the day the whole industry simply stopped existing by decree.